Hello, welcome to Oakville Matters. Thanks to Cogeco and your TV, this is our chance to talk about what matters to Oakville residents. And today, I'm figuring that maybe this year's budget and tax increase might matter to you. And so I've invited the budget chair for the council, and that would be Town and Regional Councilor Tom Adams, to join me to discuss the questions that we heard the most as we were making the budget. Councillor Adams, we're meeting virtually and everything thanks to COVID.
Great to see
Uh,
you.
I thought maybe I would start by asking you how's your family bearing up?
Well, just like everybody else, we've turned every room in our house into an office, and every kid is in virtual school, just like everybody else's kid. And so we're struggling through just as well as you could expect.
So it's a good thing you limited the number of kids to the number of rooms, I guess.
That's right. And if the Wi-Fi cuts out, it's because there's 3 classrooms going on in the background, right?
Oh my, oh my. And are you guys as parents satisfied with what shall we call it, Wi-Fi classes?
They're definitely second best to in-class experiences, in my opinion.
And
In
what are you hearing from the school board about when or if any classroom stuff will resume?
Well, our understanding is that sometime between now and tomorrow, we're going to be told just when we might go back to school, or or how much farther out they're going to push the decision in terms of making a call back to in-class sessions. So the 20th of January is when we expect to hear something.
All right. Well, I do notice that for almost a week now, the numbers in Halton and in Oakville have been pretty good. And our reproduction rate, I think, is still today 0.8, and
Mhm.
that is way better than the 1.2 it once was.
That's right. So obviously the stay home requests and orders are having some kind of impact, and they're certainly having a better impact, I think, in Halton than they are in some of the neighboring communities. And so we may be fortunate in terms of our ability to return back to a little bit of in-class instruction for school, and maybe a little bit of an earlier departure from the lockdowns than perhaps Peel and Toronto will experience. But we all have to wait and see.
Yeah, the a number one thing is keeping your distance, and it looks to me like Oakville's better at it than some of our more infected neighbors.
Yeah,
Um,
and that may be a socioeconomic thing. We certainly have a different kind of professional skill set and working environment for a lot of our residents. Certainly, the Peel issue around, particularly Brampton, where they've got warehousing issues and other processing issues where workers tend to be more shoulder to shoulder to each other. I think those are common problems for Peel.
yeah, I told the Brampton mayor who spoke about the need for paid sick leave very eloquently last week. I told him that he had spoken so persuasively about it that I would be glad to give him my support in whatever he wants to do to try to move that forward, and that will eventually become some kind of budgetary question for somebody, and that's my uh, uh, approach to our topic, which is the budget. So
It's a good segue there.
thank you. There you go. For lack of another segue. So what's the bottom line and the good or bad news for our budget? What's the impact?
So the impact, the overall increase for property taxpayers is 1.63% for 2021. And that's a breakdown between the region component, the education component, and the town of Oakville component. The town of Oakville component is a 2.29% increase, and the regional component is a 1.84% increase. And we're expecting a 0% increase on the education component. So when you combine those 3 pieces is how you get to the 1.63%. So generally speaking, that's a pretty good number, especially when you compare it with our neighbors in what's being forecasted in Burlington and Milton and Halton Hills and Mississauga, where the numbers that are already approved or are coming down the pipeline in their process are higher than the 1.63% that we're going to see. Um, everybody is dealing with COVID issues. Everybody is also dealing with infrastructure renewal issues. But Oakville is ahead of the game on the infrastructure piece, and so it allowed us to take a break from some of the infrastructure funding that we've been doing since 1996. We've had a capital infrastructure levy in Oakville, and so for more than 2 decades now, we've been providing additional funding to renew our infrastructure. Some of our neighbors haven't been doing that, so they're in a much more difficult predicament than we are. But in
I think
terms of,
isn't it safe to say that none of our neighbors ever did it till recently?
that's correct. Yeah. And Mississauga, in addition to having an infrastructure levy now, they also have a stormwater fee, which is a method by which they've removed the stormwater system from their general tax levy, and they're now funding it through a stormwater surcharge on top of your property taxes. And so, in addition to paying your taxes there, you now pay a stormwater charge, which a number of municipalities have moved to. It's not a bad concept. But it does make it difficult to compare your property taxes apple to apple in terms of one municipality to another.
Well, I know Toronto gets about $800 million a year out of its municipal land transfer tax.
That's right. So
And
it does
that's
make
like another, I don't know, 1.5% on top of whatever they raise. So comparisons do become really difficult.
Yeah, that's right. It does become difficult to compare perfectly. Within Halton, it's a little bit easier because none of the other local municipalities have any of these extra surcharges that, for example, Mississauga has a stormwater charge and Toronto has the land transfer tax component. So there are these things that make it harder to compare region to region. But within Halton, we're, as I said, the Oakville overall increase is 1.63%. Burlington's the latest forecast was about 2.9%, and they're only now entering into their operating budget discussions. Milton approved theirs at 2.19%, and Halton Hills approved theirs at 2.4%. So if you look at ours compared to our immediate neighbors, we're 0.5% lower or more, depending on the municipality. And that's been a consistent trend over the last number of years. Our budget increase that's been recommended from the budget committee and approved by council has been the lowest of our comparators immediately around us for the last 7 years. So it's been a number of years that we've seen Oakville's overall increase being lower than the neighbors.
So how did you bring the budget in at the town portion at 2.29 as opposed to more or less? What'd you have to cut? What'd you have to, I mean,
What happened there?
lift the veil and
Excellent
explain
question.
how the surgeons did the job.
There are two big stories as part of our budget this year. I alluded to one of them already, which was the infrastructure renewal piece. And as I said earlier, we have for years been socking away additional funding for infrastructure renewal and put us in a really good position. Last year, when we were working on our budget, we started discussions about reducing our infrastructure levy. And this year, we decided that we were in a position to just completely remove it this year. We'll probably have to return to having some kind of infrastructure levy in future years. But during a pandemic, it allowed us to remove a 1% increase to our, what otherwise would have been a 1% additional increase to the town portion this year. Whereas other municipalities are in a tougher position and not able to do that. And so if you'd asked me last year, what are we going to do with our infrastructure levy? I probably would have said we could probably take our foot off the gas a little bit. I don't think I would have been saying we can cut it all the way down to zero and have that be a sustainable thing. But it's certainly something that we can do on a one-time basis. The other big story is the impacts of COVID, and all municipalities are seeing impacts from COVID. And we're absolutely no different. We saw huge impacts in our estimates for 2021, particularly on the revenue side, where on the transit and in the recreational departments, we see very, very substantial drops in our revenue. And that's not an unreasonable thing to expect when People are not riding the bus. People are not able to use our rec centers. In fact, most of our recreational programs are shut down right now. And so we had to make estimates around just how big those impacts would be. We estimated a $7 million drop in revenue in our recreation department and a nearly $5 million drop in our revenue on transit this year. And there are a number of other areas where we expect to see drops in our revenue because of COVID. When you add up all these impacts of COVID, it's about $15.8 million in either drops in revenue or additional costs associated with the need for things like PPE or additional staffing for a number of particular positions. And so we had to deal with that by looking for a number of one-time temporary mitigation measures. We found about $10 million in methods to reduce our offset the pandemic impacts, and those are things like gapping of vacant positions, modifying service deliveries where it's appropriate. So certainly in the transit and the recreational areas where we've had huge drops in our revenue, we're also looking into those departments for offsetting expenses. So there's a bunch of savings that have happened that are one-time mitigation things. They're not things that would go on forever. That being said, there's still a gap between the two, the impacts of the COVID. Like I said, there's about $17 million in total COVID impacts, 15.8 million from the revenue side and the extra $1 million in COVID costs, offset by the $10 million in one-time mitigation. So that gap of about $7 million had to be filled. And we looked at a couple of methods to do that. One of the methods that we're using is going to our stabilization reserves for a one-time funding. We hope that we'll get some additional funding from the province to help support that. In fact, the province and the federal government have been very helpful over the last year in making municipalities mostly whole with respect to the cost of COVID. And so those two pieces have been very helpful to municipalities, including ourselves.
Well, I know that when I look at the city of Toronto, which is, Canada's biggest city, and so in a way they're kind of a bellwether, and in a way they set the agenda for the municipal sector. They got $2 billion. They have a $13 billion budget, more or less. They got $2 billion from the feds, and to balance their budget, they wrote in a hope of an additional 900 million to come. Did we write in hoped for federal money?
We didn't really write, no, not exactly like that. We wrote in stabilization funding. And so,
right. I want to come to that in a second, but first I wanted to establish that it sometimes looks like mom likes Toronto best. So now, when we come to our reserves, this is where I have always wondered if your background working for the bank and on top of that in risk management, is that what guides the way you advise on what kinds of revenues you can replace with reserves and what kinds you can't, and what, because we had quite the debate and quite the discussion about what was appropriate to be covered with the stabilization fund versus what wasn't.
yeah.
And it involves some concept of things that are one time as opposed to ongoing. Can you explain that?
That's an excellent point to raise. And we did have some discussions with the public with respect to just how much stabilization reserve we should use within our budget. When we go to our stabilization reserves for funding, we try at the town to use them for things that are going to be one-time expenses, not something that's going to be an ongoing expense that every year for the next 20 years we're going to be paying for something. And we do that because if you choose to run your operating budget from your reserves, you're basically trying to operate your household using just the money in your bank account, and eventually your bank account runs dry. And so in terms of the town's stabilization reserves, we have very strong reserves. Even with our expected draw on them this year, we'll still be in a position to meet the recommended levels that are out there for municipalities to maintain in terms of maintaining good standing for accessing debt markets and so forth. But in terms of what we've used the funding for from our stabilization reserves this year, it's to replace the expected one-time loss in things like our revenue, which we expect to see return in the following year. So if the pandemic is more or less run its course by the end of 2021, and in 2022 we're able to return to some kind of level of normal revenue streams from our recreation and revenue streams from our transit, we'll no longer need to draw upon our reserves to fund those operations. And that's why we think that it's a reasonable expectation to use the reserves in this one-time kind of way. What we're not using the reserves for is for funding things like increased expenses because fuel charges might have gone up on an inflationary basis, or we have salaries that are contracted through our union agreements that will increase by the rate of inflation year over year over year. Those kind of increases really ought not to be funded through reserves. They really need to be funded through an ongoing increase in your tax levy.
So I know you said as an aside that our reserves will remain strong. How much detail can you give us off the top of your head about just how strong our reserves will continue to be?
Well, to give you an idea, our projected year-end 2020 balance in our stabilization reserves, we expected to see about $66 million in our stabilization reserves. We're projecting by the end of 2021 that that'll drop ever so slightly to about 65.6 million. So the total change in our stabilization reserves is very small. It has a minor change to how our reserves relate to the size of our organization in terms of our total revenue. And our total reserves, if you include all the different kinds of reserves that we have, most of those reserves are earmarked for very specific things. We don't get to just go and use the money for whatever we want. But there's about $400 million in the town's total reserves and various reserve funds for things like development charge reserves and parkland reserves. These are all things that, for example, might fund infrastructure in the new growth parts of town over time. And so it's not money that we can just go and grab and use it for whatever. It's earmarked for very specific infrastructure projects, for example.
Now, doesn't the annual capital infrastructure levy also get sequestered in its own reserve against capital needs that aren't covered by growth? Because I'm pretty sure we can't spend it all in one year. Like maybe we should eliminate that a little more.
In essence, we do, because as I said earlier, we've been creating a capital levy since 1996 that each year what we have done as a town, we've added 1% to the town portion of the property taxes and use that 1% increase each year. So over now more than 2 decades, to fund the renewal needs of the community's infrastructure. That's things like our road resurfacing programs. It'll now be helping to fund our stormwater erosion projects and our facility replacement needs. So every time you see a recreation center getting renovated, that's where that funding is coming from generally. And so the ability to use that money year to year is important, and it comes as a piece of our operating fund. So if you see 2 budgets, one's an operating and the other's a capital budget, money comes from the operating budget, flows into the capital budget to fund those things. Much like as a homeowner, you have a income each year, and each year you might take a portion of that to fund renewal of your house. So for example, maybe this year you need to replace the roof on your home. You're taking some of your paycheck this year to do that. Next year, maybe it'll be your driveway that you do. The year after that, maybe it's the windows, and so on and so forth.
I look at the cost of replacing my roof and put a little bit away every year for the day I know I'm going to have to do it. So I've got a reserve too.
That's absolutely one way to do it. But if you look at a typical home, you probably don't build up a giant reserve, a roof reserve. You probably have funds that you set aside for what you might call home maintenance. And that's sort of what the town does in terms of maintenance of its infrastructure. We don't necessarily create a giant pile of a war chest of infrastructure money. We use it each year to fund our capital budget.
Yeah, I've noticed that people are very proud of the condition of our public facilities that they're part of here. And when you think that something like, after 25 years, it's got to be around 25% of the tax levy, the local town portion of the tax levy, is going to the infrastructure maintenance.
Yeah, it's a very significant portion of our operating budget, and it's important to recognize it. And sometimes when people see the pie charts of our operating budget, and they wonder why there's this giant piece in the corporate expenses, and a big chunk of that corporate expense is actually our funding for our infrastructure.
Maybe you could give us a little explanation of where the town's debt is and where it's headed.
Oh, that's a lovely discussion to move to.
Well, reserves and then debt, I don't know, they're
Reserves
linked
and-
somehow in my mind.
Well, that's a good question, because if you think about a household and how a household operates, there are different ways of funding different parts of a household, and one way that some people will fund infrastructure within their house or improvements to their house is by taking a loan out to do that. The town really hasn't done that. So if you look at our debt, the debt remains quite low. Specifically, the amount of debt that we have that's tax levy supported is extremely low. We're in the order of about $5 million in tax levy supported debt, which in terms of our overall debt, it's only about 5% of our overall debt that's tax levy supported. The remaining portion of our debt is supported by other sources of revenue. It's either self-supported, or the largest piece of debt that we have is actually the hospital debt, where the town provided funding to make the new Oakville Trafalgar Hospital happen. And that debt is supported by funding from Oakville Hydro and its non-electricity distribution revenue, basically.
Yeah, Oakville Hydro has been organized for many years as a unit of a holding company that used to be called Oakville Hydro Corporation, and then we had Oakville Hydro Electricity Distribution Inc. So you never knew which two you were talking
Now
about.
it's OEC. So we have you know this better than I do, but we've got a fleet of companies within the Oakville Enterprises Corporation that provides a source of ongoing revenue, and that's supporting the Oakville Trafalgar Hospital. And so during the middle of a pandemic, we're awfully happy that we have a brand new Oakville hospital that's supporting us.
That's right. It's one of the things I'm very proud of achieving. When I became mayor, I asked council to change it to Oakville Enterprises, and I asked Oakville Enterprises to see if they couldn't take a page or two from the playbook of the Edmonton hydro utility, which is now called EPCOR, and it pays a handsome dividend to the city of Edmonton by going out and operating businesses around the world in their case. In our case, we're all over Ontario, and we've got a couple of investments in the US. And so I get to say that we're paying off our hospital debt with other people's money. And I think,
and it's very, very true. So that in terms of the story of our debt, it's been a very successful method of funding various things within the town using other people's money. So there are other components. The Oakville Soccer Building is another case where the Oakville Soccer Club has been funding the Pine Glen building. The LED streetlight program is being funded by savings from the LED lights themselves. So there are all these internally supported or self-supported projects, which were debt supported initially in terms of how the funding came, but in terms of paying off that debt and its interest, it's from other sources rather than taxes.
well, I think the people in Oakville who know and understand this give us high marks for that. Um, what's the prospect for paying off the remaining $5 million in tax-supported debt? I mean, the cost of carrying $5 million on the tax levy has got to be pretty low. But as a matter of fact, you're good at doing math in your head. What must that be?
It's a tiny, tiny amount if you consider the overall size. Just to give a sense of the overall size of our budget, $214 million in tax levy coming into the town. And so, we're supporting a $5 million amount of debt on that. And much of that debt is held over the course of 10 years or more, depending on the situation. And it gets paid off in a little bit. The principal gets paid off a little bit each year, basically, as much as a mortgage might. But in terms of the overall gross size of our budget, we've got a $400 million plus budget in terms of all the various types of revenue we've got, and we're carrying a tiny little bit of debt. So it's I don't want to say it's shouldn't be looked at or worried about, but really is a small part of the overall scope of what we're doing. And we're in a good, stable position for the future as well in terms of 2022 and 2023. We're looking at overall property tax increases of 1.7 and 2% over the next 2 years. So we're in a stable position in terms of inflationary prospects for our tax increases. And I think that's where the community needs to be in terms of having stable, predictable increases over time.
You got less than a minute, and there's one remaining question I really would like you to address, and that is it a surprise to people when you do the public consultation on the budget to learn that taxes are only 59 or 60% of the budget, and that we have so much other revenue?
Yeah, it's certainly one of the things that a lot of people don't recognize is that we do actually use revenue sources from a whole bunch of different places, and that the property taxes really are only 60% of our overall revenue stream. And so, we have to look at the charges that we have for all the different services that we provide. They're important to the well-being of our community.
Well, thank you for that, and thank you for this. I'd like to invite you back to discuss the intricacies of performance-based budgeting. That way we can create a little video primer for those who may come after to learn the virtues of it and understand what we achieved with it and how it works. Because I know most people are only familiar with what used to be called departmental budgeting or other concepts. And so I look forward to, I hope you'll agree to that. And thank you for watching. Email mayor@oakville.ca if there's a topic that you'd like covered or a guest you'd like to learn from. Thanks very much.